There is a peculiar kind of darkness that does not announce itself with thunder or storm, but with silence, a quiet, creeping absence of thought, a vacuum where reason once stood. Stupidity, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer observed in his prison writings, is not merely an individual failing, a personal lapse in judgment. It is something far more insidious, more systemic. It becomes a structure, a self-reinforcing edifice built not with bricks and mortar but with surrendered minds, with the slow erosion of curiosity, with the passive acceptance of the unquestionable. To speak of stupidity as a system is to recognize it as a force that transcends individual ignorance. It is not the scattered foolishness of a single person but the organized, almost mechanical replication of thoughtlessness across a society. Bonhoeffer, writing from the confines of a Nazi prison, saw this firsthand, how entire nations could be led into moral catastrophe not solely through malice, but through the quiet normalization of unthinking compliance. Stupidity, in this sense, is not an accident. It is cultivated. It is engineered. Imagine a river that has forgotten its own current, a body of water so still that it no longer remembers how to move. Over time, sediment settles, the water grows thick, and what was once fluid becomes stagnant. This is the process by which stupidity becomes systemic, not through sudden upheaval, but through the slow accumulation of unchallenged assumptions, of truths taken for granted, of language stripped of meaning. When thought ceases to flow, when questioning is treated as rebellion rather than necessity, the river of collective intelligence begins to solidify into something rigid, something lifeless. Bonhoeffer's insight pierces through the illusion that stupidity is simply a lack of knowledge. No, it is something far more dangerous, a relinquishment of knowledge, a surrender of the responsibility to think. In the face of authoritarianism, in the shadow of propaganda, stupidity becomes a survival mechanism, a way to avoid the peril of dissent. It is easier to accept the given narrative than to question it. And so, the system of stupidity grows, fed by fear, by comfort, by the seductive lure of belonging. But if stupidity is a system, then it must have architects, not necessarily in the sense of a conspiratorial elite, but in the form of structures that reward conformity and punish curiosity, education systems that prioritize obedience over inquiry, media landscapes that trade depth for spectacle, political rhetoric that replaces nuance with slogans. These are the scaffolds upon which systemic stupidity is built. And once in place, the system perpetuates itself, not through force alone, but through the quiet, almost invisible pressure to conform. Yet, there is something profoundly tragic in this. Stupidity, as Bonhoeffer understood, is not the natural state of humanity. It is an unnatural condition, a kind of spiritual sickness. The human mind is wired for exploration, for synthesis, for wonder. But when these instincts are suppressed, when the muscles of critical thought atrophy, what remains is not mere ignorance but something far more corrosive. A willful ignorance, a refusal to see, to confront systemic stupidity, then, is not simply to decry foolishness but to recognize it as a moral and intellectual crisis. It is to see how easily thought can be replaced with dogma, how readily free minds can be conditioned into passive receptacles. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it is to acknowledge that none of us are immune. The system does not distinguish between the educated and the uneducated, the powerful and the powerless. It thrives wherever minds are lulled into complacency, wherever the act of thinking is outsourced to those who claim to know better. This is the gravity of Bonhoeffer's warning. Stupidity is not just a personal flaw but a collective failure, a societal drift toward intellectual and ethical decay. And if we are to resist it, we must first understand its mechanisms, how it takes root, how it spreads, and how it convinces so many that not thinking is the safest path forward. To grasp how stupidity becomes systemic, we must first dismantle the comforting illusion that it is merely the absence of intelligence. Bonhoeffer's observations reveal something far more unsettling. Stupidity is an active force, a kind of anti-wisdom that propagates not through ignorance alone but through the deliberate silencing of doubt. It is not that people cannot think. It is that they have been conditioned not to. The system thrives when curiosity is treated as a threat, when the act of questioning is framed as disloyalty rather than duty. At the heart of this phenomenon lies a paradox. Stupidity often wears the mask of certainty. In times of crisis, in moments of collective anxiety, people do not yearn for complexity. They crave simplicity, clear enemies, unambiguous solutions. The systemic stupidity Bonhoeffer witnessed in Nazi Germany was not a descent into primitive irrationality, but a perverse kind of rationality, one that sacrificed truth at the altar of cohesion. When propaganda replaces dialogue, when ideology overrides evidence, the system does not collapse into chaos. It hardens into a new order, one where wrong conclusions are upheld with meticulous consistency. This is why Bonhoeffer insisted that stupidity is a moral failure before it is an intellectual one. The mind can be trained to follow logic, but if the soul has been taught to fear independent thought, then logic becomes a servant of delusion. Consider how authoritarian regimes do not merely suppress dissent, they render it unimaginable. The most effective censorship is not the brute force of banning books, but the subtler art of making certain thoughts seem absurd before they are even spoken. When ridicule is weaponized against skepticism, when common sense is invoked to dismiss uncomfortable truths, the system of stupidity tightens its grip. Yet the machinery does not run on coercion alone. It is lubricated by something more insidious: vanity. People cling to stupidity not only out of fear but out of pride, out of the desire to belong to something larger than themselves. To admit uncertainty is to stand apart. To repeat the sanctioned narrative is to be enfolded into the collective. This is how stupidity becomes contagious, not through the spread of falsehoods, but through the social reward of conformity. The individual who questions is isolated. The one who nods along is embraced. And so, the system self-replicates, not through the imposition of lies but through the voluntary surrender of curiosity. Bonhoeffer's insight here is profound. Stupidity is not a passive state but an active cultivation. It requires repetition, reinforcement, the steady erosion of alternative ways of thinking. The modern world, with its algorithms and echo chambers, has only accelerated this process. We do not live in an age of misinformation, but in an age of fragmented information, where each person can inhabit a reality tailored to their prejudices. The system no longer needs to enforce stupidity. It can simply offer stupidity as the path of least resistance, the most comfortable way of moving through the world. But if stupidity is a system, then resistance must be systemic as well. It is not enough to be intelligent. One must also be courageous, willing to endure the loneliness of dissent. Bonhoeffer's life and death stand as a testament to this. He did not merely argue against the Nazi regime. He recognized that the regime's power lay in its ability to make evil seem banal, to render atrocity routine. To break the system of stupidity, then, is not just to refute lies but to restore the capacity for astonishment, to make the world strange again so that it might be seen clearly. This is the deeper meaning behind Bonhoeffer's warning. Stupidity is not a lack of knowledge but a refusal to use knowledge, a retreat from the responsibility of thought. And once this retreat becomes collective, once it is codified into institutions and norms, it takes on a life of its own. The antidote is not simply more information but more reflection, more willingness to sit with discomfort, to question not only the world but one's own place within it. There is an ancient tale about a village built atop a great clockwork machine, a device of such complexity that none could fully comprehend its design, yet so seamlessly integrated into daily life that none thought to question it. The gears turned, the pistons hissed, and the villagers adjusted their rhythms to its motions without ever asking who had built it, or why. Over generations, the machine's original purpose was forgotten, but its authority grew absolute. To suggest that its mechanisms might be flawed, or that its rhythm could be altered, was not just heresy, it was unthinkable. The machine was no longer a tool. It had become the village's mind. This is the essence of systemic stupidity, not the absence of thought, but the outsourcing of it. Bonhoeffer's observations take on a mythic quality when we see them reflected in such allegories. The machine, like any system that enforces thoughtlessness, does not argue. It does not need to. It simply is, and its sheer presence, its unassailable normality, becomes the boundary beyond which curiosity dare not wander. The villagers are not stupid in the simple sense. They are capable of great ingenuity, but only within the confines of the machine's logic. To step outside those confines would require more than intelligence. It would require imagination. the ability to conceive of a world where the machine does not dictate truth. Consider another parable, the Tower of Silent Voices. A king, fearing dissent, decreed that all his subjects must wear masks that filtered their speech, ensuring only approved words could pass through. At first, the people resisted, but over time, they grew accustomed to the constraint. Eventually, they forgot the masks were even there. Children were born into the world never knowing unfiltered speech, never knowing the taste of unshaped thought. When a stranger arrived one day, maskless and speaking freely, they did not arrest him for rebellion. They pitied him for his madness. His words were not forbidden. They were incomprehensible. The system had not just controlled language. It had altered the very capacity to hear what lay outside it. This is the deeper horror Bonhoeffer uncovered. Systemic stupidity is not merely about the suppression of truth, but the erosion of the tools needed to recognize truth. A lie, after all, can be exposed. But what happens when the ability to distinguish truth from lies has atrophied? When the senses themselves have been numbed? The Nazi regime did not simply ban opposing viewpoints. It made them unintelligible to those fully immersed in its ideology. The mask, like the machine, becomes invisible to those who have never known freedom from it. Yet there is a third parable, one that offers a glimmer of defiance. The story of the gardener and the wasteland. In a desolate land where nothing grew, the people became convinced that the barrenness was natural, inevitable. Only the gardener insisted that the soil could be fertile. If only they would dig deeper, question the assumption that the wasteland was all there could ever be. He was mocked, of course, but he planted seeds anyway, tending them in secret. When the first shoots broke through the cracked earth, it was not the sight of life that shocked the people. It was the realization that the wasteland had never been a law of nature. It was a condition they had accepted, a system they had stopped questioning. Bonhoeffer's life was that gardener's work. His resistance was not just political but epistemological, an insistence that the soil of the human mind could still bear fruit, even in the most arid climates of oppression. The system of stupidity relies on the illusion of inevitability, on the belief that the way things are is the only way they can be. To disrupt it requires more than facts. It requires the reactivation of wonder, the reopening of possibilities long buried under the weight of enforced normalcy. These parables are not mere illustrations. They are mirrors, reflecting the mechanisms by which stupidity becomes systemic. The unquestioned machine, the internalized mask, the illusory wasteland. They show how systems of thoughtlessness operate not through force alone, but through the colonization of imagination. And they remind us that the first act of resistance is not shouting truth into the silence, but remembering that silence is not the natural state of the world. The great peril of systemic stupidity lies not in its obvious manifestations, the blatant lies, the crude propaganda, but in its quiet osmosis into the mundane. It is the slow sedimentation of unexamined assumptions in our workplaces, our media diets, our political allegiances. Bonhoeffer's warning echoes across generations not because totalitarian regimes are our most pressing threat, but because the mechanisms of thought suppression have grown more sophisticated, more insidiously woven into the fabric of daily life. To resist requires more than awareness. It demands a new kind of spiritual discipline, a daily practice of intellectual and moral vigilance. Consider how modern systems engineer compliance not through terror but through exhaustion. The 24-hour news cycle, the algorithmic manipulation of outrage and fear, the constant pressure to take sides in manufactured controversies. These are not mere distractions. They are the gears of the machine, grinding down our capacity for sustained reflection until all that remains is reaction. We live in an age where it is easier to inherit an opinion than to form one, where the act of questioning dominant narratives is dismissed as contrarianism rather than critical engagement. The real-world implication is clear. Systemic stupidity thrives not when people are forced into ignorance, but when they are too overwhelmed to cultivate wisdom. The workplace offers a potent case study. Corporate cultures often reward the illusion of agreement over the messy but necessary friction of dissent. Meetings where no one voices objections, projects where no one questions underlying assumptions, decisions where the most pressing criterion is how this will play rather than whether this is right. These are the microcosms of Bonhoeffer's systemic stupidity. The antidote is not radical rebellion but the simple, subversive act of asking foundational questions. Why do we do it this way? Who benefits from this arrangement? What are we not considering? These questions disrupt the inertia of unthinking systems, creating cracks where light can enter. Education, too, has become a battleground. Standardized testing, the elimination of humanities programs, the framing of learning as purely vocational. These trends reflect a system that values compliance over curiosity. When students are trained to memorize rather than interrogate, to reproduce rather than create, we are not educating minds but programming them. The practical response is not just curriculum reform but a reclamation of education as an act of intellectual courage. Teachers who model uncertainty, who celebrate difficult questions rather than rushing to answers, who treat classrooms as laboratories of thought rather than factories of credentialing. These are the quiet revolutionaries against systemic stupidity. On a societal level, the polarization of public discourse has created conditions where stupidity flourishes not despite intelligence, but because of it. Well-educated people cling to tribal narratives with the fervor of true believers, deploying their intellect not to seek truth but to defend preconceptions. The real-world implication is that resistance must begin with epistemic humility, the recognition that no ideology, no political party, no media ecosystem has a monopoly on truth. This means cultivating relationships across divides, not to convince or convert, but to disrupt the echo chambers that make systemic stupidity possible. It means embracing discomfort as the price of intellectual integrity. Technology amplifies these dynamics in ways Bonhoeffer could scarcely have imagined. Social media platforms are not neutral tools. Their business models thrive on engagement, which often means rewarding outrage over nuance, speed over depth. The practical challenge is to use these tools without being used by them, to carve out spaces for slow thinking in a world optimized for instant reaction. This might mean digital Sabbaths, intentional consumption of long-form journalism, or simply pausing before sharing to ask, am I spreading light or just heat? Family systems, too, can perpetuate thoughtlessness across generations. The unexamined prejudices, that's just how we've always done it mentalities, the subtle discouragement of certain career paths or life choices. These are the domestic iterations of systemic stupidity. Breaking these patterns requires the courage to have uncomfortable conversations, to question inherited worldviews while honoring the humanity of those who hold them. The through line in all these examples is that systemic stupidity is not an external force imposed upon us, but a current we are all swimming in and contributing to. Resistance begins with recognizing our own complicity. The times we've stayed silent for convenience, the opinions we've adopted without examination, the complexities we've ignored for the sake of simplicity. Bonhoeffer's legacy reminds us that moral courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to think clearly in spite of it. We stand at a crossroads where the systems of thoughtlessness, political, technological, cultural, have never been more sophisticated in their ability to seduce or coerce our compliance. Yet Bonhoeffer's life testifies to a truth that transcends his historical moment, that no system can fully extinguish the human capacity for awakened thought, only tempt us to surrender it. The call here is not to heroism but to something more demanding, a daily recommitment to intellectual and moral integrity in ordinary moments. This is not about winning arguments or overthrowing regimes, but about the quieter revolution of seeing clearly in a blurred world. It means reading beyond headlines, sitting with discomfort rather than rushing to certainty, cultivating friendships that challenge rather than simply affirm us. It requires recognizing that every time we choose depth over distraction, nuance over simplicity, we are not just resisting systemic stupidity, we are rebuilding the foundations of a society where thoughtfulness can thrive. The transformational question Bonhoeffer leaves us with is not how do we defeat stupidity, but how do we remain fully human in systems designed to make us less so? The answer lies in the courage to think as an act of love, for truth, for others, for the future we are shaping with every thought we nurture or neglect. The system is powerful, but it is not invincible. Every act of conscious thought is a spark against the darkness.